Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So, Dominic Raab, a Conservative leadership candidate that I covered last week, had already threatened to ignore the will of Parliament, including any legally binding acts that they may pass and take us out of the EU without a deal on October 31st. Now, whether buoyed by taking the example of President Trump as he runs roughshod over his own constitution, I couldn't say. But a Prime Minister is not just another word for President. The offices of Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and President of the United States are very different, with different levels and systems of oversight and powers. And I can see how in many practical situations a Prime Minister could be considered to be behaving in an almost presidential manner, but only when they have a majority of MPs in Parliament backing their legislation. But the new Prime Minister will simply not have the numbers to force anything through. It's not even a given that winning the party leadership would guarantee them being confirmed as Prime Minister, though surely it would. In fact, if anyone was in any doubt, Theresa May's time in office should have taught people that a Prime Minister can actually do relatively little without the consent of Parliament. But it seems ignoring Parliament wasn't extreme enough, or didn't work for some other reason. So he's now upped the ante by suggesting that he would even prorogue Parliament to achieve this. Now, when I saw that statement, there were three thoughts that occurred to me. The first one is that it's an odd concept that a candidate who said he would simply ignore Parliament and take us out at the end of October is now saying that he'll shut Parliament down to prevent them stopping him. So if he needs to shut Parliament down in order to preventing him crashing us out of the EU unilaterally, then what was he on about with his statement about simply ignoring them? It was almost like he was either lying or utterly ignorant on the relative powers of the Prime Minister and Parliament. And I couldn't actually tell which it is in this case. He is both dishonest and frighteningly poorly informed on a range of vital issues. The second thought that occurred to me is it was actually Jacob Rees-Mogg who first floated the idea of proroguing Parliament in order to block MPs some months ago. He suggested Theresa May do it to ensure that we left at the end of March. And it occurs to me that in this leadership contest, Dominic Raab is essentially fighting the same ground as Boris Johnson. But Bojo has much more support. So I think Raab is basically trying to out-Boris by just being a more extreme version of him in his stated intentions to utterly trample on the sovereignty of Parliament. Now, given that Jacob Rees-Mogg is backing Johnson, it could simply be a ploy to attract more ERG-type votes for himself by suggesting that Boris might actually go soft in the face of opposition, as he has done in the past. And then my final thought was, but he can't do it anyway. Proroguing is the process of shutting down Parliament for a short while so that the government can prepare a Queen's speech, after which it's back up, state opening of Parliament, and the Queen's speech lays out the legislative intentions of the government for the following session. Now, a session typically lasts a year, but the current one has been already going on a couple of years because it was intended to complete the legislation needed to exit the EU. The idea of a session is, you have the legislation that needs to go through in that session, then when you've concluded your business, end it, start a new session with a new Queen's speech laying out what the next objectives are. But according to an MP today, it was it's the longest session of Parliament since about 1800, I think they were saying. But of course, we haven't completed the Brexit legislation as yet, so that's why the session hasn't ended as yet. And if we did leave by some unconstitutional shutdown of Parliament for political reasons, just so that we left the EU against the will of the public and MPs, we'd find ourselves in legal difficulties. Too many people think that the legal default is simply dropping out of the EU if we don't arrange another extension. But that is only true in EU law. If it's even true there are experts who were calling that into question. But in UK law, it's undisputedly the case that further legislation is required in order to actually leave. We do not have the legislation to leave the EU. That hasn't been done. The European Union Withdrawal Act, as I've mentioned various times before, does not provide the legislation to leave. In fact, the actual act itself says you need more legislation to actually leave. So, can the Prime Minister even prorogue Parliament? No, not really. It is going to be messy if they try. A session of Parliament is ended by the Queen, but on the advice of the Privy Council, who are senior members of Parliament. But the UK is a nation of lots of traditions steeped in history, which don't always give the right impressions of how things are really done. In reality, a session actually does end when the Prime Minister wants it to end. They've completed the legislation that they promised to complete the previous year. They want to end the session, start a new session, get the new legislation going. But in terms of the actual mechanism, it is the Queen who has to physically do it, and it is on the advice of the Privy Council. So in terms of the actual physicality of it, the Prime Minister is not, in theory, able to demand it unilaterally, even though the reality is that it is the Prime Minister that effectively does request end of sessions. Now, for Dominic Raab, under these circumstances, to ask the Queen to prorogue it would put Her Majesty in a ridiculous position. The Queen is a constitutional monarch. I did a video a while ago on the implications of that. So she essentially has to do what she's told by Parliament and or the government. So, for example, do you think she really wanted to host Donald Trump this week? Do you? There's a reason she didn't allow him and his spawn to stay at Buckingham Palace. And the reason he wasn't allowed to stay had nothing to do with renovation. Who believes that about 4 dozen rooms were all being renovated at exactly the same time when it's been known for a while the dates that the President would be visiting? No. But she gets little to no say in most affairs, and it's something people need to appreciate a little more, I think. So if the Queen does shut down Parliament in these circumstances, she's basically defying the will of Parliament. Well, the last monarch that did that caused a civil war and then misplaced their head. But if the Queen doesn't shut Parliament down, then she's defying the will of the Prime Minister on a matter for which the Prime Minister does usually decide. And although it isn't technically the Prime Minister who's supposed to advise the Queen to prorogue, as I say, it is, in practical terms, usually their decision. Just not for these reasons. So the Queen would have to either act or not act, and both options are a political choice. And the Queen is supposed to be above politics, completely neutral, at least publicly. So it would be utterly outrageous for Raab to even ask Her Majesty to do this. But although various MPs today have been attacking the plan, just as they did when rees-mogg initially suggested it, there isn't really a feeling that it actually could be done. Whether this is because the Queen would have to decline and maintain the status quo as the least political thing to do, it's quite certain that the Privy Council, which not only includes opposition MPs, but also less reckless government members, they'd oppose it, or say simply the Queen would probably just say, well, the most neutral thing I can do is do nothing, and doing nothing is keeping the session open. Whatever the reason, the question was asked as a point of order to the Speaker today, quite rightly, and John Bercow, the Commons Speaker, was moved to say that it actually can't be done, and he went on to say that it's so obvious that you can't do this under these circumstances that it was barely worth him saying anything about it. So I'd say we're essentially coming back to suggesting that Raab is probably saying this to position himself as the most committed hardline Brexiteer, to gather enough support to find himself on the ballot paper first of all, and then to present himself as the best light to the largely far right-wing membership of the Conservative Party. And don't imagine that members of a political party are always as clued up on the extent of, or the limit of prime ministerial powers as you might think. So my conclusion would basically that he's purely saying it for the consumption of party members and knows full well that he couldn't do it. Though you can't rule out genuine ignorance on what might be a tricky constitutional issue when even simple things seem to baffle this guy, like the role, for example, of the largest port in this country regarding international trade. So there we are. Hope you found the video interesting in a roundabout way. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content, and until next time, I'll see you later.